Greetings, everyone. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon. I want to welcome you to this first virtual public lecture in the OHC's annual Named Lecture Series. Before I introduce this year's series and tonight's speaker, I'll provide a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and they continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the U of O, to Oregon, and to the world. In following the Indigenous Protocol of acknowledging the original people of the land we occupy, we also extend our respect to the 9 federally recognized Indigenous nations of Oregon: the Burns Paiute Tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Coquel Indian Tribe, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and the Klamath Tribes. We express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to other displaced Indigenous people who call Oregon home. The Oregon Humanities Center's theme for 2021-22 is Imagining Futures. The series seeks to re-examine some of today's pivotal social and cultural issues in order to envision a more just and sustainable future for all of us. As with all OHC-themed lectures, this year's seek to create space for experts to share their research and knowledge and to foster conversation and understanding. Our speakers will help us to reimagine our futures around sustainable planning, climate change, Indigenous sovereignty, and racial justice. We'll have time for Q&A at the end of the talk. If you have questions at that point, please type your questions into the chat feature of Zoom. I'll moderate and ask the questions. We have also enabled the closed captioning function of Zoom. You can activate captions using the live transcript option. The talk is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Oregon Humanities Center's website and YouTube channel. I also need to give my customary thanks. First, thanks as always to the OHC's incomparable staff, our Associate Director, Gina Turner, our Program Coordinator, Melissa Gustafson, our Communications Coordinator, Peg Gerhardt. Second, many thanks to the OHC's generous donors, without whom we could not support the kind of innovative humanities research, teaching, and public programming that we do. And thanks finally to all of you for joining us tonight. I'm delighted now to introduce our speaker, Christina Rosan, Associate Professor of Geography and Urban Studies at Temple University, where she's also an affiliated faculty member in Global Studies, the Master of Public Policy Program, Latin American Studies, and the Center for Sustainable Communities. Professor Rosan will deliver the 21-22 Criticos Lecture. Established in 1993 through a gift from 2 of the OHC's generous Portland patrons, the Criticos Professorship brings to the university and the state of Oregon distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders. From the Greek kritikos, translated roughly as able to judge, evaluate, and criticize. As the term suggests, the Criticos Professorship was created to foster the education of UO students and faculty and to promote intelligent, critical public discourse around our state. Both our theme of imagining futures, as well as the Criticos Professorship's charge, help explain why we selected Christina Rosan as this year's Criticos Professor. Professor Rosan's work is motivated by the pressing question of how we might make cities more sustainable and just. She's an expert on urban sustainability planning, urban politics, metropolitan governance, urban planning, environmental studies, environmental policy, social justice, vacant land, green infrastructure, and urban agriculture. Rosan's first book, Governing the Fragmented Metropolis, Planning for Regional Sustainability, examines metropolitan governance and land use planning in Boston, Denver, and Portland, Oregon. Rosan's second book, Growing a Sustainable City, The Question of Urban Agriculture, co-authored with Hamel Purcell, was published in 2017. Rosan's forthcoming book, Reimagining Sustainable Cities, Strategies for Designing Greener, Healthier, More Equitable Communities is co-authored with Stephen Wheeler and will be published by the University of California Press in December 2021. Tonight, Professor Rosan will speak to us on the formidable topic of reimagining cities to be sustainable, healthy, resilient, green, and equitable. Please join me in welcoming Christina Rosan. It's great to have you.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's a real honor to be this year's lecturer, especially with the topic of imagining futures. I think it's so timely. So I was really happy to be invited. And I'm sad that I was not able to come out to Oregon and meet everyone in person, but I hope there's a future for that. Let me just share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. Thank you, Melissa, for the thumbs up. This is the book that is coming out with Stephen Wheeler, and I have one of the early copies of it, and we're really excited about it. It's a book that Stephen and I initially met at the Planning Association conference, and he and I had both been giving these talks again and again about sort of the failures of sustainability. And we both taught sustainable cities courses. He is at Davis and I teach at Temple. And we both felt that there was a real need for books that would kind of dig much more into the weeds about sustainable cities and sort of the history and the value systems that underlie the formation of cities. But we also wanted the book to be positive and to provide kind of a way forward, because many of our students we had found have been really depressed, and actually it's sort of depressing even to teach some of this work. So the book sort of straddles the big challenging ideas and then also trying to think about positive solutions around the world. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing it with people. And this talk will cover some of that work, and then it will also cover a lot of just my previous thinking about this idea of reimagining and sustainability. So I think this question of what would sustainable, resilient, greener, healthier, equitable cities look like is on everybody's mind. And what I want to argue is that we kind of know what it should look like. And the problem is not necessarily imagining what it should be. The problem is figuring out how to get there, and also understanding what prevents us from getting there. So I think I'm going to lay out for you that we need cities to have clean air, clean water. We need them to be equitable. We need affordable housing. We need sustainable ways to get around the city. We need green space. We mostly also need that to deal with the urban heat island impacts. We need cities to provide equitable access to opportunity. So good schools, job opportunities. We need affordable healthcare. We need meaningful work and lives, and we need cities to be fun. And that's actually something that Stephen was really pushing on is, cities are places of joy and culture. And that's why we love cities. That's why people travel. The whole tourism industry is built on the idea that cities are amazing places to visit. But we also need a culture of care, which is something that is absent in many cities around the world, where you're dealing with, many people who experience real oppression in the city and have been excluded and are cast aside. Cities also need to be places that protect the environment. And this is something that I think is really important. One of the reasons that I really love cities is because I love places that are not cities. And cities they concentrate people and resources, and they allow us to protect the rural areas and forests. And so the more that we can protect cities, the more that we can protect the rest of the world. Cities, you can reduce your ecological footprint. The per capita carbon is lower. So cities, although many people think of them as sort of anti-environmental, I'd like to argue that they are actually a key component of solving the climate crisis. And so we really need to figure out how to get as many people to live comfortably in cities. And that's going to also be an enormous challenge, given that many cities are coastal cities and sea level rise, and many climate impacts are also going to be changing the geography of where cities are going to be. Cities, I also think, are very exciting because they allow for inclusion and belonging. There are stories throughout generations of people who really came to cities so that they could be themselves. And we're seeing we're seeing movements for inclusion, and cities have always been at the forefront of that. And I think that's actually what also makes them exciting places. But cities do have a lot of challenges. Sustainable cities got to figure out how to reduce their climate impacts, so reduce CO2 emissions and kind of electrify buildings, solar, but they need to do that equitably. If in the book, we also talk a lot about creating walkable neighborhoods, and that also is good for your health. We need to figure out how to get healthy food for people, and renewable, affordable energy. And one of my big pet peeves, and the reason that I wrote the initial book, Governing the Fragmented Metropolis, is that we really want to reduce sprawl, right? We do not want neighborhoods that are just taking over green space and lack the walkability, sort of car dependent growth. So there's many good ways to do urban development that are sustainable and that do provide all these protective services for us. So in many ways, I don't think that is a surprise, and we've known for years that cities provide these benefits. But I do think what is the challenge is getting there. And many of our cities do, even though we want them to be this, they want them to have all the good stuff, but a lot of them have a lot of bad stuff in them. They're segregated, racist, unaffordable. We're increasingly too hot. They're flooded, polluted. Some of them are very boring, right? We see the sort of Starbucks of the world making everything regularized. They might be unwalkable, or they might be congested, unhealthy. So I think the issue here is we know what's good and we can't get there. And a lot of my research is trying to figure out how do we get there, and what's preventing us from that. And I think part of that, and that's why I really like this idea of reimagining, I think part of that is being frustrated that you can't get there. And so what is it that we need to do how do we reimagine institutions and the way that we live our lives so that we can actually get to this place of the equitable, green, healthy, resilient city that I promised to take you to. So in a lot of my work in Philadelphia, I've realized that when you talk about climate and sustainability, and you work with communities, you often end up in a very awkward place where community members will say, climate, great, that's really important, but that's not my main issue. I'm mostly interested right now in sort of my own survival. I'm worried about police brutality, the illegal dumping, there's gun violence, their schools are closed because of asbestos. You have lead in the water, aging infrastructure. And so residents argue that climate is something separate from their immediate needs. And what we've begun to term that is this idea of struggle space, so that the people in the communities, they are so overwhelmed by a history of oppression and injustice that and also so disenfranchised and excluded from these political processes, that they are struggling just to be heard and to get their basic needs taken care of. And one of the challenges for the sustainability people is that they don't seem to be able to connect to the local lived experience. And this is in part because we also are a society where we have excluded people of color from academia and from the news media. And it's only recently, I would argue, that many white people have begun to see this struggle space and this injustice. And what I would like to argue is that we can't make any progress on reimagining cities if we don't engage with the struggle space, and if we don't think about how climate investments need to address real people's needs, and real people have real reasons to distrust government, because government is what gave them this situation to begin with. So I'll be talking more about that, but I would just want to frame that initial struggle space for you. Here's some kind of images of what it looks like to live in the struggle space. I think of this as a really intersectional approach. Many people in Philadelphia have asthma. There's also high rates of cancer. If you live in the suburbs of Philadelphia, you are likely to live a lot longer than if you live in a low-income African-American divested community in Philadelphia. So you are hit again and again with impacts that make your health go down, and that really, like, you reduce your life expectancy. These are just some pictures of, you're dealing with trash. This is actually a pretty good trash picture. I've seen many communities, there mattresses, there's construction waste and vacant lots. The city of Philadelphia has 40,000 vacant lots, and sometimes there's just illegal dumping, and it does not go to the expensive neighborhoods. It goes to these neighborhoods that are already suffering from this disinvestment and years of redlining. So there's also in Philadelphia the challenge of a very aging aging infrastructure for the sewer system. And so on the right here, you see you see this is called CSO cast. And when the city of Philadelphia, when it rains basically more than an inch, the sewage, we have a combined sewer system. So the sewer from your house combines with the sewer from the street, and when it creates too much capacity, they let the raw sewage go out into the rivers. So this is a picture on the left is what happened during Hurricane Ida, and you can see, it actually doesn't look as bad as I know it is, but this is the Schuylkill, and totally overflowed its banks and almost went onto the highway here. You can see there's like a walkway that's basically it really ended up all in the neighborhoods. And on the right, what you see is how much raw sewage ended up in the rivers. And so that perpetual challenge of, how does this city, how's it going to deal with climate when it can't even deal on a regular basis with its water, and also thinking about clean drinking water, but also sewage water. So these are some of the challenges of cities, and also the struggle space. Sorry, let's go to the next one. So Philadelphia also has this problem. They have 40,000 vacant lots, and they do not have a community land trust. They don't, so there's, I'm sorry to lose this. Oops, can I go back here? So basically you have a city with numerous problems. I'm just trying to give you kind of a snapshot of it. But these, I think, determine this idea of the struggle space. All right, so in terms of kind of how we got here, I've written a few books, and thank you, Paul, for mentioning them. These books, I think if you had to summarize these books, they're really me trying to explore, like, how did we get here? So the book Governing the Fragmented Metropolis is really me trying to understand, why are our metropolitan regions so sprawling, and how can they deal with affordable housing and education and land use and climate. And really what I took away from that book was this system of governance is a mess. It's fragmented. We don't have a way to coordinate. We have some political institutions that are more effective than others. So I compared Boston, Denver, and Portland, but every city is always trying to maximize this sort of growth machine mentality that prevents us from really reimagining kind of, if you look at all of the metropolitan planning agencies, they all have really beautiful ideas of, oh yeah, we want to have a sustainable, resilient region. But then when you actually look at how it's governed, everybody's kind of short-term thinking, fending for themselves. They're not coordinating at a level that would allow you to actually solve these large-scale problems that are coming down the pike. So the book Governing the Fragmented Metropolis, I definitely saw some opportunities for hope, and places that you could kind of tweak the relationships among different municipalities and try to get them to work together more. But I think when you look at the scale of the climate crisis coming down, it's a little unnerving that we are woefully unprepared with our governance structure. When I have the other book, the Growing a Sustainable City, looking at Philadelphia, I was really trying to ask, you have 40,000 vacant lots in the city, and there was a lot of momentum to try to figure out, how to reuse this land, and you could use it for all these positive things, and grow food, and you could also like do a lot of community work and things like that. But what I really took away from that book was that even where you have the desire for change in cities, you don't have the urgency, you don't have the political organizations to actually make it happen. And there's not a coordinated mechanism to kind of have a coordinated discussion about, like, yeah, we need urban farms, but we also need affordable housing, and we also need parks, and we also need development. And one of the things that I saw from that research is, like, those conversations were very hard to have because of the siloed nature of a municipal government. So at the regional scale, it's fragmented and siloed, but even at the city scale, we're looking at some of the same problems. So this governance kind of nut that we have to crack, I think, is enormous. And, so I saw there's like a lot of PhD students on here and graduate students. So I think there's plenty of work for you to do in the future. I am in some ways hopeful that we are now at sort of a tipping point or a paradigm shift about that. We are going to go from kind of being okay with this broken system of governance and the struggle space and sort of accepting this, and that we might be in a place that we could kind of start to reimagine. Of course, it's also hard to do this reimagining when you're sort of paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. So, I feel like in the US, we can't decide how afraid we should be of climate. I personally I'm pretty afraid. I think the maps make me very clear that change is coming, and it's coming in our lifetimes, and our kids are going to have to figure this out, grandkids. For many of our students, it's going to be, they are going to be professionals who have to deal with enormous questions of urban relocation and urban heat islands. And so the need to both take it seriously and do the mitigation work, and also think about the adaptation with an equity focus is critical. So one of the things that I think is that you can't actually reimagine the future if you don't understand the past. And this is where, like, my background as a history major comes here in, but you have to know how we got here, and you have to see where we're now and how that's a result of the past. And then you want to be able to imagine, where are we going? And that also means taking science very seriously, and to imagine, to think about agency, that, we can actually change the future if we understand it well enough, and we're creative about changing opportunities in the future. So I will say that it is hard to reimagine. And sometimes when you are the person who keeps asking, well, should this really be, is this really okay? A lot of people kind of push back on you. I've been often told that I'm unrealistic, or what I'm talking about is impossible. And so, when I ask, well, why is this refinery still here in the middle of the city? People say, well, we need gas and it's never going to go away. So I think that question of who gets to reimagine, how far we're willing to reimagine, these are really important questions. And I think back to this governance question is, how does governance support this inclusive reimagining? So I'm going to start with a story, just kind of to emphasize this point about the challenge of reimagining. This is a picture of Philly, and back in 2011 and 12, I was really interested in the fact that the refinery, which was this top emitter of toxins and CO2 and burning fossil fuels, it was about to go bankrupt. And then the state, the federal government, and the city rescued this refinery. I live pretty close to this refinery, and I had received a postcard when I first moved to Philadelphia that I should huddle in some corner of my basement if I heard some sirens. So I had, from the very first time of kind of my introduction to Philly, was I started kind of seeing the refinery all in everything, like, oh, there's air pollution. Well, what's the role of the refinery? And I was shocked that anybody would want to bring this refinery back, and especially at this very same time that the city was pushing to be the greenest city in America. So this was this idea that Philadelphia would be the new petro metro. And this was actually a report that came out in 2015. It was called Pipeline for Growth. And I went to numerous meetings with people in Philadelphia, talking to me about the possibility that would come from fracking, and we are going to be the new economy. So you could really see in this conversation that the value system of, like, growth above all else was driving the visioning for the city. And here's where I want to push on this idea of reimagining, because I think a lot of reimagining happens all the time. But there's competing, who gets to reimagine is really important, because in 2015, the Pipeline for Growth report came out, and this is the Council for Growth, Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, Select Greater Philadelphia. They were super excited about the Marcellus Shale, and Philly would have this new economy. And at the very same time that this came out, Philadelphia is also imagining another future, which is a climate challenged future of flooding. And the irony here is that when you look at where the refinery is and where the flooding is, they're in the exact same place. So I spend a lot of time as an academic asking questions of what is going on here, and how are we squaring this contradiction? This is, to me, I felt like this was sort of insanity, and it made I could not understand how to reckon with these two visions that seem to just not be talking to each other at any point. It's interesting to see, because in 2015, I really felt like I was playing the role of the environmentalist at meetings, and I would bring up at meetings about regional planning meetings, I would suggest that this refinery was the wrong direction. And I'd really be pushed aside, like, well, we're always going to have a refinery. And so I was thinking about this idea of this missing, something is missing from our this reimagining. So, my students actually made this. I had many of my students involved in trying to understand this energy hub idea and how it contradicted. So when you're thinking about who is missing, we were starting to try to make this visible with maps. And actually on the right here, this is a map that one of my students made about the environmental justice communities and the oil trains that were running through the city. There had been a huge explosion in Canada, and what we had found with these oil trains is that when they explode, they're nearly impossible to put out, and they have a very large blast zone. So these environmental groups across the state of Pennsylvania started pushing for much more regulations with what we were calling the bomb trains. And at the time, people kept saying, well, I don't think it's really going to happen. But then we had a number of incidences where trains were sort of dangling off of bridges, and there were some real near misses on the train. So people started to wake up a little to that. And in 2014, the city council actually said, actually we are worried about this. So you started to see some breaks in the kind of energy hub, the narrative about the energy hub. You also saw at a national level that the fracking future of fracking being this transition fuel that is great, really starting to be challenged as well. So in Philly, the people who were really missing from this reimagining were these organizers, and one thing that has been really exciting to see in Philly is the fact that this is Green Justice Philly and later Philly Thrive have been really active in Philly against the refinery and pushing for a Green New Deal approach to economic development in the city. So they've been arguing that the sort of jobs versus the environment narrative is not, it is not where we want to be, and it's not real. So that we don't need to just, protecting the environment doesn't necessarily mean that we can give up jobs. So arguing that the transition will create a different set of jobs, and we need to think about that it's a much more inclusive economy that's not sacrificing many of our residents. So I would say, I hate to be excited about this, but no one was killed. On June 21st, 2019, the refinery exploded, and that was the end of the refinery and the beginning of a new reimagining. I honestly am somewhat amazed that it's closed. If you had listened to some of the things that people said to me in the back when I would talk about the refinery, you would understand why this picture of the future of Philadelphia this was actually in the Philadelphia Inquirer this week. And this picture is amazing to me because there were so many times where people just treated me like my image of the future was crazy. And this picture is way more out there than the image. I just wanted to shut it down, so I raised that here as a way to think about the power of ideas. And, it was the actual explosion, I would argue, that shut it down. But there were many people pushing to be heard that their vision was not in the initial framing of this energy hub. So I give you that example because I think climate change planning needs to be inclusive, and it needs to acknowledge existing conditions, environmental justice, the struggle space. And there's a lot of opportunities for exciting ways to connect climate investment and dealing with the future with meeting our current concerns. And I think that this kind of framing for me comes out of, I come from a background of thinking about planning really as a negotiation. And one of the things that I am always trying to understand is, like, what does this person really need? What does this community need? And I think with climate, you realize that a lot of the things that the community really needs for climate are the same things that they need to be able to protect themselves today and to meet their current needs now. And we need to figure out a way to link that if we're going to reimagine the sustainable communities. So now I'm going to turn to heat in Philadelphia. And if you look at the red lining maps, you'll see that they very much correspond with the urban heat island that we're seeing in Philadelphia already, and also that we know will be a much larger problem in the future. So parts of the city are 22 degrees hotter than other parts of the city because they have they do not have as much tree canopy. They may not have parks. And these are also the same parts of the city that were disinvested. And many of the people are housing insecure, or they may have tangled title, or they may be renters, or they may not have the capital to do home improvements or to buy air conditioning. And so you're dealing with a part of the city that is already has the disinvested structure. And on top of that, you're putting heat. And I actually, this summer I was on the news because I think the heat issue in Philadelphia is intense, and it needs to be at the forefront of it's an environmental justice, environmental racism issue, and we need to figure out how to use the resources that we have in the city of Philadelphia, particularly around climate, to ensure that neighborhoods are able to adapt. And at the very least, at the beginning, today, we need to figure out how to get everybody air conditioning. And then longer term, we need to figure out how to use investments in green stormwater and parks and other schools across the city. So, sorry, my computer is stalled. Sorry, this is the city. The good news is the city of Philadelphia is very much aware of the urban heat island challenges, and they have made this heat vulnerability index and started to prioritize investments. And the other thing that we also see is that urban heat maps very closely with some of the gun violence in the city of Philadelphia. So in terms of connecting with the struggle space, we want to make sure that we are mindful of people's current concerns in their neighborhood. So when we start to reimagine how we deal with urban heat, we can start to be more creative. And I think that's one thing that Stephen and I really tried to do in the book, is to identify these places across the world where people have been able to take a problem and then to think creatively about a solution that meets multiple benefits at once. And so I love this is a spray park. The city has invested in these sprinklers at rec centers, and they had the rec centers, so they used investments to improve these areas, and also in many cases to put impervious pavement and other green stormwater infrastructure amenities here. So they're capturing rainwater, they're providing recreation, they're also cooling people. And this also gets back to that other part of like making cities fun, right? If you're a city, if you live in a city and you don't have a car and you're not going to the Grand Canyon, we want the city to be able to provide you and your family with recreation and protection. So we know that there are a lot of benefits of bringing nature back to cities. And the city of Philadelphia has been very much a leader in the green stormwater movement. And so if you read about green stormwater, you'll always see the Green City Clean Waters plan in Philly. And this is a picture just showing you all the sort of benefits that come from trees. And I really like this picture because it brings together this much more intersectional, kind of comprehensive way of thinking about both problems and also solutions. So when we start to think of a tree as doing a lot of work for us, then we can start to think about which neighborhood needs what kind of work and which neighborhood needs this type of investment. The big challenge in Philly is that a lot of people really often push back on trees. And sometimes there's this narrative like low-income neighborhoods don't want trees. And here you could see this, they're doing a survey in Philadelphia about do you love trees or hate your trees? But the truth is that it is not really about hating trees. It's mostly about hating what trees do to your sidewalk and your sewer line and your cars and liability and maintenance. And increasingly in Philly, there's also a real concern that trees are associated with raising property values. And this is a city where we have been witnessing a lot of gentrification. So, one of the things that I want to argue, and I'll show you in a second of some of the ways that we're doing this, is that we need to think more, we need to think about trees and housing and access to capital and community land trusts and working with community groups. And we need to figure out trees themselves are not gentrifying people. Trees are a part of a process of change in the neighborhood. And for the most part, that could be good change unless it kicks people out of their neighborhoods. So we need to figure out how do we stabilize communities so that they can stay, right? And so making sure there's rent regulations and dealing with a lot of the other structural issues. So rather than kind of saying it's all about the tree, thinking more holistically about what is actually happening in these communities. And if we get out of our siloed thinking, could we solve these problems? So it's reimagining the problem and the framing of the problem is really important. We can also reimagine the way that we connect our energy transition to jobs, and we can leverage community organizations, we can partner with universities, hospitals, and we can address some of the energy affordability and security issues together. So what I think is hard is that sometimes it's very hard to see these sort of elegant solutions that solve many things at once, because everyone is working in their own bucket. So in the city of Philadelphia, we have the water department, they are working separately from housing. So when you are concerned as a community member about green gentrification, you tend to talk with the water department, but really you need a process to be able to talk to the water department and to people who deal with housing and rent protections. So one of the things that we are arguing for and working to develop are these more intersectional and community-informed policy tools and processes. And here, this kind of brings me back to that missing reimagination. One of the things that's very clear it's very clear to me is that we have a system of governance that for too long has just thought it's normal for certain communities to be excluded. It's okay for them to be dumped on. And then we don't engage them in the sort of visioning themselves of their community. So one of the things that we really want to do is try to make sure that community members have a way to be engaged in the process of identifying what they want in their community. So we've developed, this is Megan Heckert, is a faculty member at Westchester. She and I have been working for a number of years on a green stormwater equity index. And the goal here is, if the city is trying to do green stormwater all across the city in this decentralized strategy, how do we make sure that this investment it is guided by equity? And what does that mean? And I think that's really important, because a lot of people always say, oh, well, equity, but you have to really define what you mean by that. And one of the reasons that Megan and I initially started doing this research was that we saw all these benefits of greening. But then we saw that initially the city had, they were really pushing for these public-private partnerships on green stormwater infrastructure. So you could kind of only get green infrastructure if you had the capacity to cost share and work with the city. And we started to realize that there were a lot of communities that probably needed green stormwater the most, who might not be involved in these conversations, and they might be excluded from participating because of their capacity. So our argument was that, if green infrastructure does provide all these benefits, and particularly with urban heat, we need to figure out a way to prioritize who gets these benefits. And I think this conversation is actually really important right now when we're thinking about the Biden administration's focus on infrastructure. How do we decide who gets what and who needs what? And how do we link this to kind of more holistic thinking about neighborhoods? So sorry, my computer is a little slow here. This is the city's kind of, let's just put green stormwater everywhere. We were asking the question of what would an equitable distribution look like. We were also wondering, and this is part of longer term research, is, how do we include this in larger conversations about some of the neighborhoods concerned about affordable housing, green gentrification. So the model that we created is built off of this kind of logic that it says, given that the water department is spending money on green infrastructure and is incentivizing this installation often through these public-private partnerships, how do we make sure that it's equitable and it really doesn't exacerbate inequalities and actually can help address them? So this was, we initially did this work many years ago, and we used to talk about, we used to show like equity and the boxes and tell people, you know, if to be equitable, you have to give somebody more. I think at this point, the concept of equity is pretty clear to people. So what we were really looking for are which communities kind of, you know, they don't have tree canopy, they have a lot of renters, they may have been redlined, they have older people, younger people, they have, you know, maybe they don't have access to green space, or they might not have as many amenities as other communities. So could green infrastructure be reimagined to solve some of those problems for them? So as part of the Green Infrastructure Equity Index, we were also thinking about the way that urban form really is important. And, you know, the city kind of had a view that it was just green infrastructure could go anywhere. And one of the things that we thought is that green infrastructure should likely be different in every part of the city based on the typology and also based on what residents wanted in their neighborhood. And sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction here. So this is the equity index, and you can see that we created using numerous variables, and I'm not going to go into all of it, but what you can see is the areas that are in black are the areas that we've identified based on this initial, we worked with community groups, but based on those conversations with the community groups, and like we basically developed this index identifying the neighborhoods that really needed green stormwater the most according to this criteria. Now, the thing that's important here to remember is this is really a framework for thinking about it and for working with community members. And so we developed this as a way as really an ongoing conversation with residents about what was important to them and what they wanted to see in their communities. And we've taken the larger idea of the equity index, and in later work and some work we're doing now, we've tried to think about, does green infrastructure, should it be classified into different types of need? So we thought about environmental need. So in what ways could green infrastructure help you address issues of traffic, pervious surfaces, air pollution? In what ways could green infrastructure help you get more parks or trees or tree canopy? And in what ways could it address the sort of economic disadvantage so these are some of the different categories that we were looking at in the equity index. And then we could take the index, and rather than just having the one index that shows you know, which part of the neighborhood needs green infrastructure, we could start to think more strategically about what kind of need every part of the neighborhood has. And this is one neighborhood, and you can see that there's different, even with it, when you get to the smaller scale, there's different need in different neighborhoods. And the idea for this is that when you start to work with community members and identify the needs that kind of show up when you're using large scale data, then we can bring it down to the neighborhood level, and we can identify places where we can work with neighbors where they do the reimagining of, okay, you know, your neighborhood really needs this type of investment. Where do you want it? What do you want it to look like? And so here is a picture of that, when we're drilling down to the neighborhood level. Now we're in Google Street View looking at, there's some abandoned spaces. And here's where I think it brings us back to the reimagining. Each one of these parcels could be used in many different ways, and we can prioritize. Do we want affordable housing? Do we want a park? What is important to this community? And so that is what we're hoping that we can do with this index, is to build this conversation about how to use investments that are the water department's bringing and the housing department is bringing. And so, but how do we use those investments to address current need and anticipated need also? So if you look at a map of the neighborhood, you can see the different types of need, and then we can identify neighbors. We can see that there's some schools, might be some real opportunities for investment, particularly in fixing playgrounds and providing other benefits, educational benefits to students as well. So we are hoping to, well, not even just hoping, but we were awarded an NSF Smart and Connected Communities pilot project funding to build this equity index and add these other variables and think much more strategically about how do we engage residents in this reimagining about climate and thinking about communities' desire and their needs. And so this is a project that we will be working with community residents in North Philly starting in January. We've already done a lot of work meeting with residents over the years, and particularly during COVID, we had what we called it the Breakfast Club, where on Zoom we were able to meet with community members pretty much every Friday and talk with them about their concerns about gentrification, disinvestment, affordable housing, and planning issues. And so there's been a lot of momentum in really kind of getting community members interested in this work and seeing this work as important to kind of informing a larger conversation about climate resilience. So I put this picture here. This is the view from my train ride. It's often, for many years, this was just not a very attractive park, and it was sort of not taken care of. But we, see this kind of investment can solve multiple problems at once. But it requires a whole new, and this gets me back to the beginning of the talk of thinking about governance. We have to figure out ways that we can get government officials to see their work in collaboration with communities and also with other agencies. And this means identifying the co-benefits of their work. This also probably means figuring out different ways to share costs and to think strategically about long-term maintenance and other challenges that come when you make investments in communities. But if we think about climate investments as community amenities, it's a reframing, but I think it's an important one. So there's also a lot of opportunities to reimagine. In Philly, I keep reimagining this community land trust that allows us to promote urban agriculture and that also does affordable housing. One of the things that I have been arguing, and I think you'll see in this book, is that we really need to create the urgency for this kind of change. So I have gone from being an academic who hides and tries to buy up all the copies of her book and not let anyone read it, to someone who is writing articles about how Philly needs to actually get air conditioning to people and figure out how to deal with the hot weather crisis. And I am You'll find me on the radio talking about air pollution and pushing people to actually take this seriously. We're also working with community groups to visualize their experience in the city. And we've made some films and some story maps. So this is, we started this project, Our City, Our Story, Our Futures. And so working on really on this co-creation, I think that this is actually a big challenge for academics, is to try to move beyond the I'm studying you to actually I'm with you, pushing. And, and I've done a lot of collaboration with Russell Zerbo from the Clean Air Council. And I've tried to figure out how to be really an honest partner with them. So this is, again, this is open access, trying to get people to say, hey, urban ag, it's cool, but you got to do it more. It's not just about gardens, it's about green space, affordable housing, the long-term resiliency and kind of sustainability. And these are systems that need to work together. Here's another policy paper we've pushed for, can we use this equity index to promote environmental justice and beat pandemics? So a lot of these tools, they can be applied in different ways. And so one of the things that we realized during the pandemic was like all of the things that we had already identified as kind of the struggle space and the challenges, we already had the tools to see these things. And if now you're focusing on pandemics, we could use similar tools to identify vulnerability of communities depending on depending on how we saw the problem. So we were really pushing on that. And we've been doing in Philly this kind of, this idea of this more inclusivity and a lot of the things that I've been talking about today. So here I want to end with, this is after Hurricane Ida, and this is actually a highway. This is 676 through the middle of Philadelphia. It basically turned into a canal. People were asking for boats and on Facebook Marketplace, and then a lot of people looked at this and they said, "Oh, it looks really nice. Maybe this is a new vision for the city of Philadelphia." So this idea of who does the reimagining. It's clear that we need to figure out a way to get everybody to be able to reimagine in the conversation and make it a much more inclusive and equitable. And nature is part of this conversation. Sometimes nature is going to reimagine for us. So I'm going to keep writing my articles and hoping people will listen and they don't think I'm crazy when I try to question whether or not we should have a refinery in the middle of a huge city with air pollution. And meanwhile, nature will do its work. So thank you for your time. And if anyone wants to get in touch or find out more, this is my contact info. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that very interesting and provocative conversation, talk with us. Now it's time to turn to the Q&A section of our evening. And I want to remind you that the way to do that is to use the chat function of Zoom. Just type your questions into the chat box and I will ask them of Professor Rosan. We've already got a bunch, so I will start, and a couple of them are lengthy. What if the issue is the state and city itself? Everything you're saying makes me think it's certain people or departments in power shutting out those whose voices are the most important. Ruth Wilson Gilmore makes the assertion that the state is multiple and contradictory. Do you see a future where those who aren't listened to can use certain parts of the state or the city as a means of wrenching power away and self-determining their own futures? Is there a future where planning or planners can align themselves against the city and the state as enablers of the community?
I feel like that came from someone in our department. So
Yes, it's
that's
Bellamy.
one of our students.
It's Bellamy.
Okay, so great. Hi, Bellamy. That is an enormous question that I'm definitely not going to be able to give you the right answer to that. But I will say that I think a lot of these relationships are really up in the air. Planners right now are going through a total crisis of identity. Like, what is their role? And have we been enabling this discrimination? And it's clear they have, right? So there are a lot of people who are in those positions now who are trying to figure out how to do good work. I think they need to kind of scream that they can't do the work because they're in their little buckets, and you can't solve large scale problems from these kind of everybody hanging out in their isolated place. We need to figure out new systems. I'm not talking about like big draconian approaches, but we need some kind of coordinated approach to these policy problems. I think there's also going to be a role for social movements to push hard on government officials to do things differently. This is not okay. And we need them to hear that again and again. And we also need to change what the people in government look like. It can't, there shouldn't be rooms. I've been in many rooms in Philadelphia where the policymakers are all white and the city is not. So there's obviously, a huge equity, inclusion, diversity challenge that's going to happen professionally. So it's a great question, Bellamy. I wish I had the answer. So I know you're working on your PhD, so you can help me.
So the next question, short of an explosion, how can urban land containing principal polluters and carbon emitters be put to better community-friendly use? Regardless of what we as an inclusive community can imagine, developers invest for profit. Local government budgets are limited, so perhaps the Fed needs to pay fossil operations to close rather than rescue them.
Yeah, you guys are tough in these questions. I guess it's a good question. It's like a good history question. Like, had it not exploded, what would have happened? Would like Philly Thrive and all of these organizations have been so kind of in your face about fracking and, environmental justice and environmental racism that like it would have been an embarrassment to these oil companies that they would have pulled back and said, it's not worth it to us? I think, so that's a question, which we'll never really know the answer to. So, but one of the things that I initially, it was actually a paper that I never got published, but it sort of drove me to do other research. I had done a paper that was trying to figure out like why Chicago had been able to shut the the power plants in Chicago had shut down, but Philly had reopened the refinery. And the finding that I had there was that a lot of it also depended on federal energy structures. So I think as we transition away from fossil fuels, we are going to see fewer of these facilities staying online. I think we are going to have a big cleanup problem. But so, the federal kind of policy is definitely going to change the landscape of the fossil fuel industry, which will change urban land all across the country. Every city, I can't really think of a city that doesn't have one of these problems of a big polluting fossil fuel infrastructure.
So you talked about green gentrification when working with adding green space to lower income neighborhoods. How does adding green space lead to gentrification, and how do we avoid it?
Well, I'm of the opinion that gentrification is like is a pretty complicated process, and that what happens is that we value as we value places that are, have trees, are shaded, have amenities. So there are many places in the city that don't have those amenities because they've been redlined and environmental racism. So the challenge, and I think it's a really, on one hand, it's very tough, and on the other hand, I feel like it's not. So the challenge is we want to improve these neighborhoods and we want to bring the wealth back to neighborhoods, but we don't want to do that in a way that like just brings in a whole bunch of other people who get to live in with a nice park in the shade. We want to figure out a way that people get to stay in these neighborhoods that they have been holding the fort down for generations. I think we do that through affordable housing, and I think we have the potential to be able to do that. I can think in Boston, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative with their community land trust has done some amazing work. So one of the things we need is to figure out how to get the city to prioritize like affordable housing, green space, and not just let's give all the land to the developers, which is, so right now the model is like the water department's greening at the same time that the city is kind of, is letting developers roll. So we need to figure out how to kind of, if we know we're going to green and improve neighborhoods, how do we, before that happens, make sure affordable housing gets put in? And that also means that we need like some really forward thinkers, people who are able to, walk and chew gum at the same time.
This next question, I think, is related to what you were just saying. Urban land is a highly marketable commodity under prevailing power structures and deep-rooted economic interests. How do you convince local and state governments to use it for people and not for profit?
Is a great question. Well, I mean, I do think we are going to have some serious conversations around climate, about how we fund cities. The idea that we fund cities with property taxes, if you want to understand urban sprawl in the United States of America, that it's about financing, right? So we've created a whole group of people in city government who view land as a way to just create revenue, rather than viewing land as a way of creating spaces and places that people want to live in. And so I think that we, we're going to have some massive conversations with the climate, with climate change, about the urban growth machine model, because we're going to have also a lot of places that are going to be underwater, and they're not going to be able to be generating the same kind of revenue. So, do I have the answer for that? No, I do not. Is that an enormous question that, like, if you wanted to solve all these problems, you were going to have to go there? Yes, definitely. It's like, if we have to figure out, we have to be more honest about how, like, what is driving us to make these terrible decisions, and the growth machine is key.
The next question might be related to something you just said as well. While much of your talk looks at how to transform existing settled areas to be more resilient, this questioner, Fletcher, is wondering if you have thoughts on how to engage in reimagining with communities that will be erased by climate change. In Philadelphia, for example, Eastwick is predicted to be gone within 20 years. But this is true in many cities. The water will come and there will be local refugees. So do you have thoughts about how we think about imagining that the fact that some communities will need to be elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about it, Fletch, and I think it's very, I mean, it's really devastating for communities to say to them, you know, everything that's important to you is going to be gone. And but how do we, you know, I think, how do we have that conversation? I think part of the issue right now is like, there's so much distrust of those communities. Those are the same environmental justice communities that have been, they've borne the brunt of, you know, of just mistreatment and exclusion, environmental racism again and again. So like, why are they going to trust the government when the government comes and says to them, hey, you got to move, you know? And so I think those conversations are they are going to need a whole new framework for, you know, like how we have community conversations about the future. I don't know, you know, I don't know what the answer is, to be honest. Like it, but I know that unless you figure out how to include people in the conversation and to build trust, that you are not going to be able to have that conversation with them. So that's, you know, that we really need to figure out a way to trust people. And then we also have to give them, reimagine a place that people go that's good, you know? So like, how do we build space for those people in other communities that isn't just taking them from one undesirable place to another, you know? And so it's an enormous question. I don't know the answer. I think that's very clear that it's huge.
So the next question is from Lynn Peterson, who is the president of the Oregon Metro Council. And I know, as you know, from your first book, you know that Oregon Metro has been on the cutting edge of all the issues you've brought up. So here's the question. While we have another 9 to 12 months to make progress on the issues of the day, the Oregon Metro Council is looking to update their 50-year plan from 2040 to 2070. Can you give any advice in that effort?
Well, I guess, I mean, first of all, I'm excited that you came to my talk, so that's awesome. You know, I mean, it's interesting because when you say 2050 and then 2070, it's like 2050, you can kind of pretend maybe climate's not that bad, but 2070, like you really can't anymore. So I think that's like the first thing, is that you've now jumped the, you can't really hedge your bets on the climate aspect. So that's one. I think the other thing is, you know, is going back and making sure that that, you know, people were included earlier on. You know, I mean, Portland does a better job than other places of this. So I think you have that going for you, because, you know, you do have these public conversations. But I think if there's a way to engage citizens in this imagining and the reimagining, and thinking of it as not just scary, but actually as exciting, and there's some possibilities, maybe that's a way forward. But I also do think this idea of the struggle space could also be something important. You being able to show people that your 2070 plan is just not some crazy out there long-term thing, but it's actually about them now, and it's informed by them now, and it'll help improve their lives and their kids' lives. That's probably another way forward. So good luck. I think it's amazing that you guys are doing that kind of work with communities. And, you know, and I know that Portland has been trying to do a lot more on equity, and I commend you guys on that.
Next question. Are there any model examples where city-funded green infrastructure has had meaningful success, that has resulted in more equitable more equitability and less gentrification? And if yes, what are some of the elements of such a program, of such an example?
Hmm. Um, I mean, I think there's a lot of more recent focus on like development without displacement. And I can't say that like, oh, this city is awesome at this. And, you know, I don't think there's like one place that has this right. But I do think that the like special sauce of not gentrifying places is is like really listening to communities about their concerns and figuring out a way to connect that with different city agencies. One of the things that I've been super frustrated with in different conversations with city officials is, you know, sometimes when people say, well, oh, they don't like trees, you know, and I think like, oh, wow, you really are not talking to people, because it's not that they don't like trees, you know, it's like we need context and we need to figure out. So I think the places that are having those public conversations, maybe this gets back to the other question from Portland Metro, is like the contextualizing, the public conversations, the showing that like greening is necessary to deal with climate resilience, and B, like we actually do care that you get to stay here, and we're going to address those concerns, you know. So instead of dismissing them, we are going to work collaboratively. So yeah, I think the good news is that, like, you know, there's so many new conversations post, you know, like COVID, Black Lives Matter, like that, about the sort of reimagining of cities and doing things differently. I don't see the like on the ground thing yet, but I feel like it's coming. So like maybe if you check back a few years from now, I'll have the great example. But in the meantime, I think that people, I think it's like the awareness that like you can't just green, because, you know, people will spend more money to live in green areas, and, you know, a lot of wealthy people are coming back to the city. And so unless we figure out how to protect people, you know, we are just going to be pushing particularly Black and brown people out of their homes.
Next question. As cities adopt more eco-friendly solutions, what sorts of employment opportunities would be made available? How can these green public works projects replace the antiquated, dirty jobs such as coal refining?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the dirty job question, and that was part of, you know, initially when I sort of came out against the refinery a long time ago, that, you know, people said, oh, but these are good jobs, you know, and my pushback was, well, these are actually not good jobs, because yes, they pay you, but they have all these other impacts. I think there's a lot of excitement about green jobs and possibility for solar installation and maintenance of green stormwater. And, you know, I think there's a lot of jobs that are going to require rebuilding cities in a different way. I mean, when I think about the amount of infrastructure money that like hopefully comes down to address climate change, there's so much work to be done. It's amazing, you know. So I feel like there are going to be a lot of jobs, and we just have to figure out a way to make those jobs good jobs. And we need to figure out, like, from an educational perspective, we need to figure out how to train people for those jobs and make sure that those jobs go to people from the neighborhood, you know, that maybe you don't need a college education to get all of these jobs. So I think trying to figure out how to open the opportunities up is really important. But there's so much like weatherization, home repairs, and solar panels and parks to be built, and just basic like pipes to be pulled up and replaced and new systems. I mean, I think that's actually really exciting. I'm kind of optimistic that if we kind of divorce ourselves from this, like the only good job is a dirty job, or then we can move forward. But I think partially we kind of need to like let go of the fossil fuel industry, and we just can't do it yet.
When you were discussing urban heat islands, you pointed to the similarities between the map of gun violence and the map of heat levels. Have there been any studies about the effects of diminishing heat islands and levels of violence that could help support this initiative, these kind of efforts?
Well, that's a great question. There have been a lot of studies about the relationship between heat and gun violence. I don't know if we've fixed the urban heat islands enough to do the research that you would need to answer that question. I think that would be like 5 years from now, that might be an amazing research question. And you could try to figure out, like, are these interventions contributing to reduction in gun violence, and in what ways are they doing it? And what are the causes of, in what ways is heat creating contributing to gun violence? So it's a really fantastic question. I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to be able to make these arguments. So we don't have, and this goes back to the sort of other, I think a lot of these things are sort of unproven at this point, because we're in that innovation era where we're kind of rethinking how to do it. But we don't necessarily have all the data points to say it definitely works, X number of trees equals X number of reduction in gun violence. I can't do that. But longer term, we could think about how to ask that question.
So you spoke early in the talk about the importance of understanding how we got here. Do you have any recommendations of books that help us understand how we got here?
Well, I do in my class. So some of the people in here have taken my public policy class. I have a few books that I always, we read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I think that's a really important book just to deal with the sort of racial segregation. So that is one of them. I'm trying to remember all the other books. Someone in my class probably can tell me what they are. Another book I do also, I think it's a really good book, is by Mona Hanna-Attisha. I'm not sure how to say it, and from Detroit. And she's written a book about the Flint, Michigan story. That I think she does a really beautiful job. She's a doctor who really dealt with the lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan. And so really important book there. I'm thinking, who else is it? I don't know, someone in the chat can like put some of the other books that we had. I'm trying to think of other.
Well, while we're waiting, I have another question for you.
Okay, go for it.
As we work to prevent climate change, how do we adapt neighborhoods to the current climate change, like how the people of Philadelphia turned a flooded highway into a canal?
Well, they didn't turn it into a canal. I was sort of joking about the boats. It really became a canal. So in terms of how do we adapt now, I think we admit that that it's hotter and that there's certain people, and so like, for instance, in Philadelphia, it's flooding. We know that. So like, which neighborhoods are getting flooded? How do we, either deal with fixing their basements or getting those neighborhoods more green stormwater, or, like some kind of financing program to make sure that they can deal with the flooding and the kind of all these other problems that come with flooding, like mold and, home repairs and stuff. But then the other issue is the urban heat island is making sure that people have air conditioning. I'm always surprised that some cities have actually started to mandate that, you can't rent an apartment to someone without air conditioning. That seems pretty basic. Most cities don't do that. So I think that's key. The other issue in Philadelphia is our public schools do not have air conditioning. So, some do, but the majority of them don't. So figuring out, some of these investments that are really critical for kids to be able to go to school and using these facilities as real backups are super important. So yeah, I think you have to meet people where they are, and we need to go talk to people about their experience in neighborhoods. And that means, it's going to be some uncomfortable conversations, because a lot of people in neighborhoods are really distrustful of academics and of policymakers, and they feel like no one's listening to them. But we need to go talk with people and find out what they need now to deal with some of these things, because it's not now some kind of long-term thing. It's like right now, you can't sleep, and you're having people die during heat emergencies. So how do we admit that we're having these problems and figure out how to get those resources to people? So yes, that's what I would do.
So here's a really simple question. When does your book come out, and how do you order it?
The book comes out on December 7th. It's on University of California Press has the book. I don't know, go to your favorite local bookstore, or you could order online from them. And so that's good old capitalism will get you the book. We did try to make it affordable. And that was actually one of the things that Stephen and I really fought for, is we did not want to have a $60 book. So hopefully it will be more accessible to you. But yes, please reach out if you have any questions or you want to talk. I really appreciate all of you spending your evening with me.
So Tina, we've come to the end of the questions that we've had, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, to share your ideas about the futures that we might imagine. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. So good night.
For more information on other upcoming events sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center, or if you'd like to contribute to supporting our public events and research programs, visit ohc.uoregon.edu. Thanks again for watching.